all printed on the same paper is one of the first things you notice. Some pages are fairly thick, some are really like tissue paper thin, which suggests that the printer was just grabbing whatever paper he could get and not really caring how consistent the product was. It has 228 leaves, which means 456 pages, the way we usually count in books. The binding is a little bit odd in reasons that aren't that important. The page numbering starts over twice through the book, suggesting maybe it was going to be 3 books before they eventually decided to make it 1 book. And that's how we get the book. This is the title page to Joachim Meyer's book, and this is maybe one of the most elaborate prints in the book. If Tobias Stimmer was involved at all, he probably did this one, and only this one. But I'm not here to talk about that, because way more interesting than the actual book itself is the books.
50.
Here are 25 different copies of Joachim Meyer's book that currently exist. The first 25 copies that I got of the first edition. And at this resolution, you can't make out a lot of details, but the first thing you might notice is that some of these have painting on them, and many do not. Some of them have writing on them, and many do not. And they're all different sizes, even though the actual picture on it is the same size, or ought to be. The paper that it's on was cut in many different sizes. I'm going to talk about all of those things. In 2019, a woman in the Meyer Freifechter Guild named Sarah Barsness learned at Meyer Symposium that no one had any idea how many copies of Meyer actually exist. And she said, I'm an archivist, I know how to do research, I'm going to find out. And she produced a list that had 38 copies of Meyer's book on it, and posted it on Facebook in the Meyer Freifechter Guild Facebook group, and said, hey guys, can you help me build this out? And I got really excited by this, because I've wondered forever how many copies there were, and how many were printed, and lots of questions like that. And we started expanding it. We went through a bunch of different kinds of catalogs, looking for copies of Meyer, and also deduplicating when they get listed in different places. And many people in the HEMA research community who had some experience with Meyer were pointing out copies they found that no one else had knew about. And ultimately we ended up with 67, oh, I need to update this. There's actually, we know of 71 copies of Meyer now, which I believe is 40 copies of the 1570 and 31 copies of the 1600 now. Some of which are lost at the moment. The library says, well, we definitely used to have this book. We have no idea what happened to it. And that happened to at least 3 of them. And a couple of them are dismembered, by which I mean there's just a collection of pages that had been cut out of a copy of the book, and we don't know where the rest of the book is. Usually the picture pages get cut out. Chris Amberger in Maryland has something like 50-something individual page pictures from a copy of Meyer that he bought from an antique shop, with the rest of the book missing, for example. There's also 3 manuscripts in 14 different countries. Here's a map of where they all are. Astute viewers might notice that in order to get North America and Europe to fit on the same screen, I had to eliminate Greenland to shrink the Atlantic Ocean. It's actually much wider than that. The Atlantic Ocean is far, although not as big as the Pacific. But here, there's no Meyer in Greenland, though, so it doesn't matter that much. But here you can see there are about 10-ish copies in the U.S. There's one in Austin, there's one elsewhere in Texas from a private collector. There are several on the East Coast. I've been to see most of them, but not all of them. And there are quite a few around Europe. The farthest east, I think, are the 2 copies in Moscow. So, once we had this list, we said, all right, cool. The next question is, what's frickin' in these books? So we started sending people to go to libraries, request the books, and actually look at them and take pictures of anything that was interesting. And we got people in New York and people from CKDF in Washington to go into the Library of Congress and the Met and so forth and look at them. TQ in England started looking at books in London, and we started getting information back slowly of, some of these books have writing in them, some of these books have illustrations that are painted. And we were really starting to make a lot of progress in answering some of these questions when a certain worldwide event happened. Now we come into early 2020, and libraries started closing down, and we could no longer send people to actually do some of this. So into the breach, we started getting all of these scans, because a lot of libraries still had, thank you. This is the reproduction of a copy of Meyer that I mentioned, which I was just going to pass around so you could all look at it. This is approximately the correct size, materials, and everything else of a copy of Meyer. That specifically the copy in Leipzig is what the covers are based on. So a lot of librarians were still working in their closed libraries, and they were happy to spend some time paging through their copies of Meyer, sending us notes, or getting them scanned. So I've got about 25 copies of scans of the 1570, and about 20 copies of scans of the second edition from 1600. So many scans. So, what did we learn? This is what the lecture was actually supposed to be about. Yes?
You said before there were 3 books. Was it actually physically 3 books, or is that just how it was organized?
So, do you mean the 3 page numbers in the book? The page numbers start over at the beginning of the Dusak section and the beginning of the dagger section. So the sword section has page numbers, and then it goes back to page 1 when the Dusak starts, and then rapier, and then back to page 1 with dagger. So it's all in a single book, but it could have been released as 3 books, and that's the only real reason you would do page numbers like that. If you thought they would be published separately or bound separately. Or the other possible explanation is Meyer didn't have enough money to pay for all of it at once, and he didn't start at the beginning. So the part that they started working on it was maybe Dusak, maybe dagger, and they didn't know what the page numbers would be for the earlier part. It could be either one of those. We don't really know how it ended up the way that it is, but it's numbered 1 to 65, and then 1 to 107, and then 1 to 40 something. So the first thing we learned, which actually we already knew, but it underscores that every book is unique. Even though today we think of books as being... So it's interesting. If you ask someone about a book today, we have this idea in our heads that there is this perfect book that an author created in their mind, and any print errors or things like that are corruptions of the book. So if you have a copy of Joe Brassey's new book, and I have a copy of Joe Brassey's new book, then they are both essentially the same book. And this is not really true today, because every book is still unique. But in this time period, each book could be very different from other copies of the same text. And I'm going to tell you some of the ways they're different. Even before the printing finishes, we often have the printer going through and discovering errors in the text and correcting them without stopping the printing or redoing anything that had already been done. So when we look at these books, we find differences between individual copies, like errors in the page numbers might be fixed. This says XCXIX, which is something like 9019 in Roman numerals, and then the printer corrected it to XCXVII, or 9018, still not 98, but closer. The extra X was not removed. Here in this illustration, there are these black marks that appear in some books and not the others, which are defects in the plate. And they were probably meant to be carved into letters or numbers to label the picture, but they didn't get carved. And then at some point in the printing, they said, that's not right, and they scraped that part off. So we have copies that have blank, and we have copies that have a black rectangle. You might also notice these pages are not the same size. The picture is the same size, but as part of binding, you would cut the book down to the size that the actual owner wanted it to be. And sometimes they would cut so aggressively they would actually remove content. Here they just barely have all the words at the top here. There are other copies where the words run off the edge of the page if it's too close to the edge. So this is probably close to the original size of the book, and is about what that one is that we're passing around. Others are much smaller. Binding is a completely different trade from printing. Printers would not put covers on books. A printer would sell you a stack of pages, which you would take to a binder and have a bookbinder put a binding on it. Which means that every single copy of Meyer has a unique binding that's different from every other copy of Meyer. No two copies look the same. And apparently I actually have a slide about resizing. Here's another example of an original size page and a page that's been cut down. This is in Munich versus Bern. Wait, that's a lie. This is Berlin. You can see the paint bleed through. The Munich isn't painted. I should fix that. Not right now, though. Berlin and Munich are two of the ones that have uncut pages. Although, well, technically, I shouldn't call them uncut. They have the correct size pages. You will find occasionally books that have what's called ragged edges, where they're literally uncut at all, and they just have the raw sheet of paper the printer printed on, and they're not even perfect rectangles. So that's not this. These were all cut to the right shape. They just only trimmed off the ragged part and not any of the solid paper. The materials you would use, there are parchment bindings. So this is a parchmenter. His whole job is to create parchment. This is a tanner. His job is to create leather. This is a redsmith. His job is to carve copper into shapes and forge copper or brass fixtures. All of that goes into binding a book. This is the copy in Stockholm. It's a pretty typical leather pigskin binding. You can see there's all kinds of what's called tooling on it, where they would take metal tools and stamp them into the leather to create cool shapes. In other countries, they would often put gold foil like this under the stamps to make gold tooling. But the Germans loved what's called blind tooling, where it's just these blank impressions. So it doesn't have nearly as much contrast as metallic ones. Sorry. I am so going to lose my voice this weekend. You'll notice there are two metal clasps. That book has four. They're completely pointless. The point of clasps is for parchment books. If parchment is exposed to any kind of damp air, like if you just take it outside, it will start to buckle and swell, and it will no longer be flat. And so they would put clasps on books to smash the covers over the parchment and prevent it from warping. Paper doesn't do that. But they kept putting clasps on books for centuries after they stopped doing very much with parchment, because that's how books are. They have clasps. You got to put clasps on. It has three spine.
Reyes.
So they're, what's the right term?
Ferrules? No. How about
We'll call them frets. Basically, when you sew the book together, you stitch the pages onto these strips of either fabric or leather. And then when they put the binding over it, they attach those strips into the wooden covers usually, and they will tend to stick out and create this impression in the spine. But it's not decorative. Today, when they put this on books, they just put a lump in the spine to make it look fancy. But originally, it had a function in how the book was constructed. And copies of Meyer will have 3 or sometimes 4 or even 5 of these. Because again, the sewing was done by hand in different workshops all over the place. It was not done in a standardized way. This one has 3, as does this copy, which is what the one you just looked at was a replica of. This impression in the middle is interesting with these 2 women, one of whom is Justice holding a sword, and one of whom is Lucretia stabbing herself in the heart with a dagger. and the text underneath. This is a really common decoration you see on books in the late 16th century from certain parts of Germany. And actually, a lot of copies of Meyer have a version of this. Usually only one on each side. This one's interesting because it has both on both sides of the cover, and then various other decorations. You'll also see this one used to have metal corner pieces to protect the cover, which are gone. But I put them on this book just for fun. Yeah,
Does this one have the inconsistencies on the thickness of the parchment?
it does. The paper has... Actually, I can't say that with certainty. I have not looked at this one in person. I've looked at 4 or 5 copies of the 1570, and all of them did. So I assume that every other one does as well.
How do you measure that? Like with a caliper or something like that?
You can tell just by touching it
Okay,
that
okay.
some of them are feel thicker and stiffer than others. It's unclear if there's 2 or 3 kinds of paper usually, and for that I would need to use calipers or something, which I didn't. But there's at least 2 that are noticeably different, and sometimes there are borderline cases that could be a third.
Can it be done just to lower the price of making it?
Yeah, I think it's just that they would buy whatever paper they could get, especially if you're a sort of low-class printer like Thibault Berger. And then once they would print the sheets, they would just stack each individual set of pages. And I didn't cover this, but printing would usually be done on these very large sheets that are kind of like poster board, and they would get cut down into individual pages.
Thank you, Thibault. by
But
the way.
that means that